Okay, let's begin. So we're going to go through some theory exam revision. This is all for your level 2 principles of anatomy, physiology and fitness. And we're splitting it up into different sections. So what I'll do is I'll tackle a section at a time. Some sections are longer than others. And if you feel like I'm missing bits out, well, I'm not going to be covering the entire manual, obviously, in 2 hours, but I'm focusing on the most important bits. So just think about this as a revision summary. And so we're not covering everything, but it's going to be very concise and it's going to be a really, really helpful revision tool for you guys. So revisit this recording and have a look at the slides as well that I'll upload to the folder in Edmodo. So I'm going to go skeletal system first. So first of all, let's kick off with the functions of the skeleton. So use your chat box. And guys, if any questions I ask today, if you haven't got a clue, don't worry. I'm not expecting you guys to know this stuff. It's just always interesting to find out if you do know some stuff already. So what do you think your skeleton's for? You guys are watching this at home as well. Just start, have a think. Use a notepad and a pen. Start doing some scribbles. Thank you. So we've got body shape. We've got protecting organs. Good. That's definitely 2 functions. Holds everything up together. Yep. So that's going to be providing that shape or support. Keeps everything together. Yep. Okay. So first one you've covered, shape. So the skeleton basically gives the body its basic shape. So if we didn't have the skeleton, we'd just be like a load of mush on the floor, I should imagine. Protection. For example, the brain protects the skull and the ribs protect the heart and lungs. And attachment. So we obviously have bones that are attached to muscles, and the muscles attach to the bones with tendons. When the muscles pull on the tendons pull the bones, and that obviously creates movement as well. So ligaments, tendons, and muscles attached to bones create stability and movement. Muscles pull on long bones to create movement. Production. What do we think bones produce? What do we think? What goes on inside the bone, right down the center? I'll give you a clue. Think about bone marrow. What's bone marrow producing? Any ideas? Don't worry if you don't know any. Blood cells, basically. So some bones produce red to carry oxygen and white to fight infection. So red and white blood cells. And storage. So inside the bone, we store something. Any ideas what that might be? Something that's found, yay, there we go, calcium. Yeah, calcium's one of them. So minerals, basically, phosphorus, calcium, massive storage reservoir, I guess, for calcium. And we need the calcium, obviously, to support our growth and development. So we will lay down new bone cells. We utilize calcium for that. Calcium is really, really important. Now, the bones come in different types as well. So we have long bones, irregular, short, flat, and sesamoid. And if you look at the picture, a long bone is characterized by having a body longer than its width. So that femur there, it's the thigh bone, is definitely longer than its width. You've also got your phalanges, which are your fingers and your toes. They're definitely longer than their width. And if you look at your fibula, your tibia, your humerus, your ulna, your radius, all those bones. We also got irregular bones, so they have an irregular shape. So if you look at the bones of the vertebrae, they are a bit of an irregular shape. You can't really describe those in any other way. Short bones, and if you look at the diagram there, it's referring to these little bones in the wrist. So a bit confusing, that diagram, because you might think it's talking about the fingers, but it's not. The fingers are actually long bones because they're phalanges, are long bones, but the wrist bones are carpals. So they are shorter than they are wide. And then we've got flat bones. Flat bones are anything with a relatively flat surface to it. So a scapula certainly is, the sternum, your pelvis, and your cranium, all the little bones that make up your skull are flat bones. And then the sesamoid is found in the kneecap. So if you look at the kneecap there, which is called the patella, it's kind of seed-shaped, and sesamoid basically means seed-shaped. Now, these are the bones of the skeleton that you need to know for your level 2. And the best way to obviously remember these is through repetition. So just covering up the names and trying to label them. Or if you've got kids, you can get some post-it notes and turn it into a game, get them to stand in the front room and try and put all the post-it notes in the right place, labeling all their bones and then checking in your manual. I'm sure they'll enjoy that. Obviously your own kids, don't just go sticking post-it notes on other people's kids. Now let's just talk about some specific bones and ways I remember them. So if we look at the humerus here, humerus is the bone in the upper arm, and we also know it as the funny bone. And humerus also means funny, so that helps you to remember that one. And now the radius, if you look at the radius, it's the one that joins onto the thumb. And just by your thumb, you have what we call the radial pulse. And that's obviously so we can check somebody's pulse. So that always helps me remember that one. Now, if you look at the hands, in the sort of just after the carpals, before we get to the phalanges, so these long bones here, you've got metacarpals. Now, meta means comes after. So carpals, and then metacarpals is comes after carpals, basically. And so that sometimes helps. And then you've got the same down here. So you've got the spelling mistake there, ignore that. Should say tarsals. Tarsals, and then you've got metatarsals, which is comes after. But yeah, as I said, yeah, I would just keep looking at that slide, maybe try and write them down a few times yourself. Now you can divide all those bones up into 2 separate structures. So you've got your appendicular skeleton and your axial skeleton. And your appendicular skeleton on the diagram is all the pink areas. And it's basically your shoulder girdle, and then all the bones that come off that. So the humerus, the radius, the ulna, the carpals and metacarpals and the phalanges. And then your hip girdle, so the pelvis, the thigh bones there, the femur, patella, tibia, fibula, tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges. Now your axial skeleton is kind of like your core, really. So it's the white area in the diagram. So it's the vertebrae, the ribs, the sternum, and the skull, or the cranium. Okay, moving on to the spine. You've got different sections to your spine. So right at the top, we've got what we call the cervical section. In the middle, we've got the thoracic. And then towards the bottom, we've got the lumbar. And then we've got 2 areas which are actually fused bones. So those bones don't move. And we've got which is the sacrum and the coccyx. Now, as you're looking at that, you can see that you've got 4 curves, basically. You've got 2 concave or what we call hollow curves, and then you've got 2 convex rounded curves. And the reason you have this is because it helps to reduce impact stress. So when you're walking, carrying load, when you're doing your exercises in the gym, maintaining that kind of neutral alignment of the spine means that you evenly distribute the load over the spine, and there's no excessive curves, and it, like I say, just reduces the impact stress. Now, what's very, very sensible to do is to memorize how many bones there are in each section of the spine. So before I tell you, does anybody know how many bones there are in the cervical region of the spine? Have a think about it if you're watching this at home. Don't worry if you don't. Now, the way I remember this, I'll just remember the order. So in my head, I always remember 7, 12, 5, 5, 4, 7, 12, 5, 5, 4, 7, 12, 5, 5, 4, 7, 12, 5, 5, 4. So just when if you get a question in the exam, just think of me, that annoying 7, 12, 5, 5, 4, 7, 12, 5, 5, 4. 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 4 coccygeal or coccyx. So these two bottom ones, the 5 and the 4 at the bottom, as I said, they are what we call fibrous joints, which means they're fused together, those bones. There's no movement there. Whereas the rest of these bones are what we call cartilaginous joints, which means there is some movement. Not a huge amount, but there is some movement there. Okay, moving on to posture. Now, as you look at this diagram, you can see there's a line that runs between the middle of the ear, the middle of the shoulder, the middle of the hip, the middle of the knee, and then just ahead of the ankle. And that is what we refer to as, optimal posture. So if you want, all 4 curves present in the spine so that the impact stress is reduced as best as possible, that's the posture that you're looking for. So when you're looking at a client, you can just, get to stand from the side and just observe and just see if you've got that line really going through all those joints. You can make a lot of what we call a plumb line, where you just put a weight on the end of a bit of string and hold it by the ear and just let it drop straight down to the ground and just see where that string goes. And you can identify whether they've got any postural deviations. So we'll move on to some postural deviations next. First one is a hyperlordosis. So as you look at that, you can see there's an excessive curve in the lumbar region of the spine, which is obviously toward the bottom of the spine. And we call that an anterior tilt. So anterior means the front of the body. So it's just tilting towards the front of the body. Now with that, you're going to get lengthened abs. So your abs are going to be long. Your glutes tend to be a bit weaker and don't often engage. So when you're doing things like squatting, they're not engaging as much, which is why we talk about doing glute activations to try and engage the glutes as much as you can. Your hamstrings are often tight, not necessarily shortened, but tight. They're just limited in mobility. Your hip flexors, which are at the top of your thigh, they'll be shortened. And, as I said, you get this big lumbar curve here. And I remember the way I always used to remember it when I did my revision was the L for lordosis. I used to think was, you'd get like a big L shape at the bottom of the spine. Short erectus spinae. So that's the muscles that extend the spine. So you've got muscles that run all the way out the back, and they can become shortened and tight, basically. So that gives you an idea of what you need to do to correct it. So if you've got a client that's got this hyperlordosis, which can come from, actually it can come from pregnancy. So if you've got a baby in your tummy, the weight of that baby is going to tilt that pelvis anteriorly. So, once they've had the baby, it should eventually correct itself. But it could also come from just having too much fat in that area. So if you've got a large tummy, or more technical term is abdominal adiposity, then you'd be looking at reducing the abdominal adiposity, and that should help to correct that as well. But otherwise, it's strengthening the glutes, stretching the hamstrings, the hip flexors, and then that should over time correct it. Hyperkyphosis. So this is a very common one. If you look at the posture of this person, they've got a big curve in the thoracic part of the spine. And with that, you're going to have rounded shoulders. So it's the kind of hunchback look, really. And this can come from sitting in front of a computer for too long. Anyone that's got a sedentary job where they sit down with their hands in front of them, whether they're operating something in front of them, it's a computer or a workbench, they're in danger of this. So what you end up doing is getting very, very tight pecs. You get weak back muscles. Your head starts to push forward a little bit. I've even noticed it ever so slightly. I noticed it myself very, very recently. First time I've ever seen it myself. And actually, I'll tell a lie. It was my partner that pointed it out, and I looked at the photo and I was like, "Damn it, you're right." And that's because I spend a lot more time in front of a computer these days than I ever used to. But I'm on it. So what I'm doing is stretching my pecs and working on my shoulder retractors. So if you look at the list there, the other bits we have mentioned there is you'll get a posterior deltoid lengthened. So that's the rear deltoids. They can be slightly longer because they're constantly being stretched when you're sitting in front of a computer. You might get that increased lumbar curve as well, and short erector spinae. So my advice to anyone with that condition is to try not to be a sedentary, stretch the pecs and the anterior deltoids, work the posterior deltoids and the shoulder retractors, which is basically your traps and lats. And then we've got scoliosis. So scoliosis is where you've got a sort of S shape in your spine, but when you're looking at someone from the rear or from the front. And this can be caused from basically having an imbalance between the left and the right side of the body. So if you've got very, very dominant left side or a very, very dominant right side, those muscles are often very strong but tight. And then the other side, the muscles can be lengthened but weak. And then you can imagine that's just going to pull everything out of alignment. So the obvious thing there is to stretch the tight muscles, strengthen the weak muscles, and that should start to even things out. Now, when we write programs for people, it's unlikely that we ever forget to train somebody's one side of somebody's bodies. So we write a program, we plan it so it's balanced. But often when we do a lot of fixed resistance machines, if they're machines that don't have individual pulleys, it's very easy to overcompensate on your dominant sides, which just increases the deficit between your left and your right side. So I would chuck some dumbbell work in, chuck kettlebell work in, and that's going to help to avoid this imbalance between the left and the right. Now, by the way, these 3 spinal deviations, I've been talking about, almost the self-inflicted causes or the environmental causes of this. It can come from, your genetics. You can be unfortunately just born with a spine that's a different shape, of course, that could happen to anyone. Okay, going to move on to what's actually contained in a long bone. So this is specifically a long bone, so not necessarily the other bones, just the long bone. And what you can see in the diagram, you've got an expanded portion at either end of a bone. And it's that expanded portion that contains what we call the epiphyseal plate. Now, the epiphyseal plate is, another name for it is a growth plate. So that's where your growth occurs. So when you're young, obviously those are very active because they're growing, and they can be quite vulnerable. So this is one of the reasons why we don't get kids doing heavy lifting and too much impact, because those growth plates can get damaged and it can stunt their growth, or it can cause the bones to grow funny or deformed. Now, the long shaft we refer to as the diaphysis, and down the middle you can see in the label there it says it has the medullary cavity, and a cavity is basically a space, so a big space, like you might have a cavity in your teeth. It's a space in the middle of the bone, and inside that space, that's where you have the bone marrow, which is producing all those blood cells. The white marrow is producing the white blood cells, and the red marrow is producing the red blood cells. Now, one of the great things about physical activity is that when we do anything that applies resistance to either end of the bone, it actually helps to increase the density of it. So that pressure over time, the body will lay down more new bone cells, which will then strengthen the bones. You get a much denser bone. If we don't, the opposite to that is losing bone density, and that's known as osteoporosis. Or osteopenia is like a precursor to it, so it's like the beginning of it. And then osteoporosis is where you've actually, you've lost a significant amount of bone density. So the way to avoid that is eat lots of foods with calcium in and do weight-bearing exercise and resistance training. Okay, we've got different joints, haven't we, that bring all the bones together. So the definition of a joint is a point where two or more bones connect or come together. And we have fibrous, which I mentioned earlier. So if you look at the skull there, you can see there's these little joins, and that's where all the little bones of the skull are coming together. Now they're fibrous, which means they're fixed. So those bones don't move. They're not supposed to move. They're supposed to stay fixed. Cranium, sacrum, coccyx. You've got cartilaginous joints. So these are what we call semi-movable. So if you look at the vertebrae, there is a bit of movement there, isn't there? I mean, it looks like we get loads of movement in the spine, but that's because we have so many bones, and when they all move a little bit, we get a lot of movement. And then we've got synovial joints. So these are, I guess, the ones that we talk about the most, really, because they're the freely movable joints. Knees, hips, shoulders. And they're called synovial joints because they contain synovial fluid. They're the most freely movable, which means they're also the most prone to injury. And there's certain characteristics that they have. So if you look at the diagram there, you can see that it kind of looks like a capsule. Well, it is a capsule, really. That's what we refer to it as. And within that capsule, you've got your fluid. So that synovial fluid acts as a lubricant. So when you guys warm up, you're encouraging the synovial membrane to basically secrete that fluid, but also warming it to make it less viscous, so your joint's very freely movable. You've got your ligaments there that attach the bone to bone. And you've also got what we call hyaline or articular cartilage, which lines the bones. And that basically acts as a shock absorber. So if your bones didn't have that, they would just rub against each other, which would be really, really painful. Osteoarthritis is basically wear and tear of this area so that the bone is rubbing against each other, which is not something you want. You haven't got that shock absorption. Now the ligaments obviously join the bones to bones, but they're great for stabilizing the joint and protecting it. And again, big fan of resistance training, because another one of the great advantages of strength training, resistance training, whatever you want to call it, is it thickens those ligaments. And when you've got thick ligaments, you're less likely to hurt or harm your joints. All enclosed in a nice fibrous capsule. And as I mentioned, filled with synovial fluid. So it's like a little self-lubricating system that you have when you exercise. Now this is just purely focusing on that synovial joint. You've also got 6 types of joint within that synovial joint category. So if you didn't know this, if you've never heard of this, obviously it's in your manual, but feel free to write them down. You've got ball and socket joint. So that is the hip and the shoulder. And that has the biggest range of motion of all the joints in the body. So if you think about your hip, or if you feel free to do it now, if no one's watching. If in a public place, you might not want to do this, but just start swinging your arm around, swinging your leg around, and then you can see all the potential for movement. You've got extension, flexion, abduction, adduction, rotation, circumduction, horizontal flexion, extension. If these are new words, don't worry, I'll come to these in a bit. But yeah, lots of movement, basically. Does mean it's a bit vulnerable to injury. And then we've got a hinge joint. So your knees and your elbows, they've got actually very limited range of motion. They can only flex and extend. So if you look at your elbows now, you can just flex them and extend them. You've also got pivot joints, and the pivot joints are found where the atlas and axis is in the neck. So if you look left and you look right, that's your atlas and your axis joint. So you've just got basically one bone sitting on top of another and just pivoting around it. You've also got one where your radius and your ulnar come together. You've got one there. So if you look at your arm and you rotate it, so you turn your palm upside down and back over, that's that pivot joint working there. And you've got your saddle joint. This is just really found at the base of the thumb, and you can look at the how it looks. It looks like a sort of saddle slotting onto a horse. And you've got quite a bit of range of motion at the thumb. If you look at your thumb now and you move it around, you can do circumduction, which is where you circle it. You can flex it, extend it, abduct it, adduct it, but you can't rotate it, which is what the ball and socket can do. But saddle joint, can't rotate it. And that's why we used to have thumb screws back in the day, because obviously you can't rotate your thumb. So that would be a horrible torture method. Now we have things like exams instead to torture you. Condyloid joint. This is where you get like a concave surface slotting onto a convex surface, found between the metacarpals and the phalanges. You can see there. And I believe this is the last one, gliding joint. This is where you've got two smooth surfaces that just kind of glide over each other. And you find that between your scapula and your clavicle. Okay, joint actions. Now, the best way to remember these guys is to actually do these as I read them. So again, if you're in a public place, well, actually screw it, just do it anyway, it doesn't matter. Try and do these because it will reinforce it. Now, flexion is where the angle at a joint decreases. So in layman's terms, it's bending a body part, isn't it? So when you curl a barbell up towards your shoulder, that's flexion. When you lower that barbell down, that's extension. We do that with our legs as well, don't we? Like the leg extension machine is where you extend the knee. The hip curl, the leg curl is where you then flex the knee. So the angle's getting smaller, flexion, angle's getting bigger, extension. Abduction is moving a body part away from the midline. And the way I always remember this is abduction. Think about aliens abducting your body part. Aliens taking your body part away, that's abduction. Adduction is adding it back to the midline. Now these next two, rotation and circumduction, sometimes people get them muddled up. Now the easiest way to remember that is rotation is circular movement, but around its own axis. So if you look at your arm and you just sort of turn your palm over, turn it back over, that's rotation of the arm. And you can do that with your head, you can turn your hand side to side. Circumduction is actually making circular movements. So if you then draw a circle with your arm, that's circumduction. Lateral flexion is, well, it's got the word flexion, so we know that it's bending and it's reducing the angle at a joint, but it's specifically to the side. Lateral, think of sideways. So if you bend your body to the side, that's lateral flexion. Lateral extension is the opposite. So if you bend to the side and then you straighten yourself again, that's lateral extension. You do the same with your neck. If you drop your head to the side, that's lateral flexion. Bring your head back up, lateral extension. Now, horizontal flexion, a little bit more complicated, but just different. If you imagine when you do a pec fly, so you've got your arms out to the side and then you bring them together, You've got flexion occurring because the angle between your arm and your body gets smaller as you bring that arm towards your middle of your body. But the way I always remember this is just think about bringing your arm across the horizon, horizontal flexion. So think just sweeping your arm across the horizon to the center of your body, horizontal flexion. And if you take that arm away, horizontal extension. Okay, last ones. Elevation. So this is upward movement of a body part. Now think about your shoulder girdle. When you bring your shoulder girdle up towards your ears, it's like shrugging your shoulders, that's elevation. When you drop your shoulders down, that's depression. Protraction is bringing your shoulders forward. So, you know, if you throw a punch, you bring your shoulder forwards. That's protraction. You know, if you bring them both together at the same time, protraction. If you take the shoulders back, that's retraction. And any muscles that bring your shoulders back, like your traps, I call your shoulder retractors, and they're the ones that we strengthen to try and correct a kyphosis. Then we've got plantar flexion. So this is pointing the toes downwards. The way I always remember that is P for pointing, really. Pointy toes, plantar, point. Oh, and somebody else said to me the other day, one of my students said, oh, the way I remember it is plants are on the ground, and if you were going to point your foot at a plant, you'd be pointing it towards the ground. So that's quite a good one too. Dorsiflexion's just the opposite. Point the toes towards your shin. Pronation. So this is where you face your palm upwards. Sorry, face your palm downwards. And supination is facing upwards. And the way I always remember this is if you bring your hands together, so you create like a little bowl. So you think about Oliver Twist walking up to, who was it, Fagin, saying, please can I have some more? He brought his hands together, and that's supination. Make a little soup bowl with your hands, that's supination if your palms are facing up. And pronation is just the opposite, palms facing down. Quite a useful one to remember because you get supinated and pronated grips. So if somebody says to you, do a supinated chin up, then you can bring your hands together, make a soup bowl, and you're like, oh, okay, cool, so I need my hands that way around. Inversion is talking about the sole of the foot, and that's where you bring the sole of your foot in. So inversion, bring the sole of the foot in. Eversion is the opposite. So quite a few terms there, but yeah, like as always, just repetition, repetition, repetition. Okay, right, I've done enough talking, so I want you to have a little think about some of the things I mentioned, but anything you know yourself. What are the effects of exercise on the skeletal system? Think the immediate effects, what happens as soon as you start exercising, but then what are the long-term effects? And like the good stuff, why is exercising long-term good for your skeletal system? Off you go, use your chat box, or if you're at home doing this, just scribble it down on some paper. Okay, good, thank you. Yeah, so it could be good for posture, couldn't it? Yeah, certainly if we're working our, well, I guess that's a bit more to the muscular system because we're talking about working the muscles evenly and creating balance, but it's still a long-term effect, certainly. Yay, increasing bone density. So that's certainly a great long-term effect. In the strength and conditioning world, they refer to it as armor building, and I kind of like that. I always thought that sounded really cool. So if you play contact sports, then by strengthening up doing some strength training, resistance training, yeah, you get some nice dense muscle, but you get some nice dense bones as well. So it's like having armor. Okay, so immediate effects. We're looking at increased secretion of synovial fluid. No, it's not so good for the nose, is it? You don't tend to. No, I've had my nose broken like 3 times, and it doesn't seem to get any stronger. So, increased synovial fluid secretion, increase in blood flow and nutrients to the bones and joints. So that's great, isn't it? Sending more oxygen and all the nutrients we need to the joints. Um, and obviously, muscles pull on the bones to increase our range of motion. Now, long term, so this is the good stuff. Bone density, bone strength, joint stability, stronger ligaments and tendons, improved posture. You're absolutely right there, Ash. Improved cartilage health, improved range of motion, leading to improved flexibility, reduced risk of osteoporosis, and reduced risk for fractures. So again, armor building. Okay, so that sums up what you need to know for the skeletal system. So, revisit that, take some notes, learn it like the back of your hand. We're going to move on to neuromuscular system. Right, we've got 3 types of muscle tissue. Anybody got any ideas what those 3 types of muscle tissue are? Have a little think. You got an answer? Put it in the chat box. You're at home, write it down a bit of paper before I say it. I say at home, you're probably all at home, aren't you? Unless you're in the pub. Anyone doing this in the pub? Skeletal. Thank you. Yeah, that's one of them. Skeletal. Okay, we've also got smooth. So smooth is found in your digestive organs. Sorry, your organs like your digestive system. And the way to recognize smooth muscle is, well, it's smooth. So if you're ever in a butcher's, have a look in the fridge in front of you, and you'll see all the smooth things like liver, kidneys, they're made of smooth muscle. And you've got cardiac muscle, and cardiac is specifically found in the heart. And as you guys said, skeletal muscle. Now, there are some similarities with some of these. So cardiac and skeletal are both striated, which basically means they're made up of individual fibers. If you looked at them under a microscope, you'd see these little individual strips or strands or stripes, whatever you want to call them. When somebody's very, very lean, like look at bodybuilders on stage, you can see the fibers in the muscles. Now, smooth muscle and cardiac, they've got something in common. So what do you reckon those 2 have got in common? What smooth muscle and cardiac muscle got in common? Have a little think. Tricky one. Good. Yeah, they both do make up organs because the smooth muscles, digestive system, that's an organ, isn't it? All those elements, and the heart's an organ. So you are right, Fern. It wasn't the answer I was after, but you are right. They're both involuntary. So with skeletal muscle, we tell it to contract, whereas smooth and cardiac, it does it automatically. So it comes under what we call the autonomic nervous system. So it just does it without us having to tell it to, which is great because otherwise you go to sleep at night and your heart would stop. Now, when we refer to muscles, we refer to them as the anterior muscles and the posterior muscles. And anterior is the front of the body. So make sure you know that, because when they talk about muscles in the exam, they'll say anterior or posterior. So anterior is everything you see on the front of the body there. So you've got your deltoids, which are your shoulder muscles. You can actually see the upper traps from the posterior as well. But if someone's got developed upper traps, you'll see them from the anterior. Pectoralis major is your chest. Biceps brachii, your biceps, your front of arm. You've got your internal and your external obliques, and they are part of your torso, and they actually rotate the torso. So if you're doing any sort of abdominal work that involves rotation of your torso, that's working those muscles. Your rectus abdominis is your abs, and that obviously flex your spine. And then you've got your quadriceps, they will extend your knee. Your adductor muscles are anything that brings your leg toward the midline of your body. Your iliopsoas is your hip flexor, or part of your hip flexor group anyway. So iliopsoas, just think about lifting your knee upwards. Abductors are the group of muscles that take the leg away from your body. And then you've got your tibialis anterior, and that's responsible for dorsiflexion of your foot. And in answer to your question, I would learn the full names because that's how they'll be written in your theory exam. When you're talking to clients, you don't say this. Like, you don't go, right, I've chosen you this one to work your internal and external obliques, and then we're going to move on to your iliopsoas. You don't. You just sound like an idiot. And they wouldn't know what you're talking about. What you tend to do is talk about the area. So front of thigh, back of thigh, chest, shoulders, and you point to the areas. But you guys have got to know it anyway for your theory exam. And the posterior skeletal muscles are obviously, like we said, everything you see from the back of the body. So you can see all the traps there, the upper, the middle, the lower. You've also got your rhomboids, which you can't see really because they're behind the traps, but they're like the deep muscles that bring your shoulder blades together. Back of the arm, you've got your triceps, brachii. The erector spinae is the one that extends the spine. So it actually runs up the entire spine and it just straightens that spine. The latissimus dorsi are the big muscles in your back. So I remember seeing on Facebook once, somebody posted a picture that said, Red Bull doesn't give you wings, lat pull downs do. And it's basically your lats are like your wings. Hip abductors, we saw the front as well, so that's anything that takes your leg away from you. Gluteus maximus is that big main muscle that extends your hips, so it will take your thigh backwards, and it's also engaged when you take your leg away from you. Your hamstrings, they also engage during hip extension, so when you take your thigh backwards, but they will also flex the knee. And then you've got two muscles in your that make up your calves, the gastrocnemius and the soleus. Gastrocnemius is the big muscle belly, the main part of the calf, and the soleus is lower down and behind. But they both basically work on plantar flexion of the foot, so you can point your toes. So when you stand on your tiptoes. Okay, now if you've never seen this slide before, this is going to freak you out because it's a bit technical. I'll try and make it sound as clear and useful as possible. But it's just to give you an understanding of what actually is inside the muscle and how it all works at I guess, a microscopic level. So we know that muscles attach to bones by tendons. So you can see that in the diagram there. There's the tendon that attaches the bone to the muscle belly. Now, all the way around the outside of the muscle, you have something called fascia. So fascia is like a sheath that just keeps everything together, keeps it all contained. So there's your muscle belly. Now, the epimysium is the sheath that surrounds the entire muscle belly. So epimysium contains everything within that muscle belly. If you slice through that, you can then pull out what we call a fasciculi. So fasciculi is like the next smallest structure down from the muscle belly. And somebody described this to me the other day. Oh, so it's a bit like a Russian doll. And I guess it kind of is, isn't it? You just got, get smaller and smaller and smaller. So your fasciculi has a perimysium around the outside. So that's the sheath that holds the fasciculi together. And if you slice through that, you can then pull out a muscle fiber. And what the slide doesn't really show you is the muscle fiber is about the thickness of a human hair. So that's how small we're getting there. And the muscle fiber is held together with the endomysium. So you've got the endomysium keeping that fiber together, containing everything within that. And inside the muscle fiber is the myofibril. And they are invisible to the human eye. So you can't see those. You have to look at them under a microscope. Now let's zoom in. So we imagine we've got our microscope out. And we're now zooming in on the myofibril. All the way along the myofibril, you've got sections. So you can see there, that is a section. And we call that section a sarcomere. And that's the contractile component of the muscle. So that's the bit that is actually causing the muscle to contract, which then obviously pulls on the tendons, that pulls on the bone, that creates the movement. This whole bit there is responsible for the movement. Now, if we zoom in on that sarcomere, we've got some what we call protein filaments, or also known as myofilaments. And we have actin and we have myosin. Now, looking at that, you can see that the myosin is much thicker than the actin. And the way I always remember that is I think of muscly, meaty, massive myosin. And then actin's the skinny one, there, the yellow bit. And the way I remember that is actin is actually the active part, because what happens is the myosin, can you see these little, they refer to these as hook-like projections or cross bridges, and I don't really like any of those. They look like just little kind of ball things. But those little ball things attach themselves to the actin, and then they pull on the actin, and the actin slides over the top of the myosin, and that's what shortens the sarcomere. And if the sarcomere is shortening, well, we've got sarcomeres all over in the entire length of the myofibril. So if they're shortening, the entire myofibril shortens, which means the muscle fiber shortens, which means the fasciculi shortens, which means the muscle belly shortens. You get my drift. Okay, now this is a bit easier to understand, this bit, muscle fiber types. You've probably come across this or heard something about this. If you haven't, don't worry, because I'm going to go into it now. But we have different fiber types. So, you know, we just zoomed in on a muscle fiber, but we have different types of muscle fibers. We've got our type 1, which we refer to as slow. We've got our type 2A, which technically are fast, but in the fitness world, we kind of refer to them as intermediate, and I'll explain why in a minute. And then we've got type 2B, which are definitely fast. And those descriptions give you an idea of what their characteristics might be. So before I tell you, use your chat box or use your note paper there at home and scribble some notes down. What would you think would be some characteristics of type 1 fibers? Okay, yeah, low intensity. They favour low intensity exercise. Which, if you think about the activities that are low intensity, so it's long, slow duration type exercise. So, you know, a long run, walk, swim, cycle. It's those sort of exercise. So type 1 fibers are very oxidative. They resist fatigue really well. They're very good endurance capacity, and they're rich in red blood cells, which contain all the oxygen. They're rich in mitochondria, and mitochondria are responsible for aerobic respiration. So that makes sense because they're very aerobic. They do have low force production, so they're not strong. They're not going to contract very forcefully and produce much force, but they are very slow to fatigue. Now, if you think about the sort of athletes that would likely utilize their type 1s a lot, it's going to be anyone that sort of engages in those sort of activities. So, you know, endurance athletes, basically. Okay, what about type 2s? Power. Yep, you're right. Power. Power, strength. Pretty much everything the opposite, isn't it? So these are actually white as well. So if you looked at these under a microscope, they look sort of white or grey, and that's because they have a really bad red blood cell supply because they don't need the oxygen. They work anaerobically, so they favour anaerobic activity. Throwing, jumping, lifting heavy, short duration sprints. Poor in mitochondria, high force production, but quick to fatigue. Now, our type 2A fibers, we call these intermediate because they are very good at taking on the characteristics of either type 1 or type 2B, depending on how you train them. So if you guys go out and run every single day, do lots of endurance type training, your type 2As are going to become very much like the type 1s. If you were to do lots of heavy lifting, lots of running, jumping, throwing, your type 2As are going to take on characteristics that make them more like type 2Bs. Now, I guess the other thing that's important or interesting to know is that what determines your distribution of fiber types is actually your genes. So it's your parents, really. So some of you will have quite an even split. You know, you might have 50% type 1 and 50% type 2A and type 2B. Or, you know, it could be 40-60. What you tend to find is that anyone that is an elite athlete in either endurance or high intensity sports like sprinting, jumping, throwing, have a massive abundance of one or the other. So like Mo Farah will have a large quantity of type 1 fibers. Usain Bolt will have a large quantity of type 2B. So let's go through the roles of the muscles. Now this bit's interesting because it has a lot more kind of applied understanding with this. So, you know, some of the stuff with anatomy and physiology, you sort of think, oh, do I really need to know this? Is it going to make me a better trainer? But knowing what the roles of muscles are certainly does make you a better trainer, in my opinion. So we have prime movers, which are also known as agonists. Now, these are basically the muscles that are responsible for doing the bulk of the work. So if you look at that girl there doing a bicep curl, her biceps are the prime mover there, or the agonist, which means they're doing the main work there, aren't they? That's the kind of the target muscle. Now, when you look in a lot of gyms, when they have a label showing all the muscles and which muscles are worked during the exercise, the red areas are the prime movers, and then the pink areas are synergists, which we'll talk about in a minute. Antagonists, they are the opposing muscles, so the opposite muscle to the agonist. Now we must relax the antagonist in order for the agonist to work properly. So during that lady's bicep curl, her antagonist is the triceps, so they need to relax in order for those biceps to contract. And don't forget these switch, these aren't fixed roles, because if she was doing a tricep push down, the triceps would become the agonist and the biceps would become the antagonist. And then we've got synergists. So synergists are muscles that aid or modifies the agonist movement. So for example, the brachialis and the bicep curls, there's also a small muscle within the arm there called the brachialis, and that assists with the bicep curl. When we do a bench press, our triceps assist with that, don't they? So it's not just our pecs that work, our triceps work as well, and the anterior deltoids. And then we've got fixators. And fixators basically stabilize a joint and they prevent unwanted movement. So if you think about deltoids and traps, they will stabilize the shoulder girdle during a bicep curl and during a lot of exercise, really. When you're holding shopping bags, they're working as stabilizers. You also have, the muscles of the torso, they stabilize the joints and the vertebrae, don't they? So when you're trying to maintain that upright posture, you've got all those fixator muscles stabilizing that posture. So different roles there, all very important. Now you've also got different types of muscle contraction. Again, important to know this. So if you look at a traditional plank, so that exercise there where you're maintaining that neutral spine, where the muscles that maintain the neutral spine, they're being stressed or challenged, but there's no change in muscle length, which basically means that it's an isometric contraction. So isometric means static, iso means same, metric is length. So same length, meaning the muscles don't change in length. Now when someone's doing a plank and you go over and you check and you give them a little nudge with your leg, everything's going to feel tight and solid. So those muscles are contracting, but they're not lengthening and shortening. Then you've got isotonic movements. So isotonic movements are a muscle contraction with movement. So it's kind of like the opposite to isometric. So the muscle, there is tension in the muscle, but there's movement. And there's two types. So the next two that we can discuss, they come under the heading of isotonic. So you have concentric, also referred to as a positive contraction. And you have eccentric, which is referred to as a negative contraction. So as that lady's curling the bar up towards her chest, the muscles in her biceps are getting shorter. So that is a concentric contraction. I used to think about it as constricting. That used to kind of help me. So if it's concentric, it's like constriction or contraction, contracting. Now, as that bar's being lowered, the biceps are still working because they're basically breaking the descent, aren't they, of the bar? Gravity's making that bar drop, and the biceps are slowing the descent of it. So they're still working, but they're getting longer, and that's what the eccentric part is. So muscle tension whilst getting longer. And then I used to think about E for elastic, like stretching an elastic band. That kind of helped me. Now with eccentric phase, it's responsible for a muscle soreness. Well, this is the theory. The central part of the exercise is the main part that's responsible for a specific muscle soreness that we get 12 to 48 hours after training. And what do we call that? Have you guys come across this before? The name for the sore muscles from training. It's not just eccentric exercise, but we just know it's particularly bad if you do a lot of slow eccentric work. Begins with D. Might not have come across it. Delayed onset of muscle soreness. So we don't call it that really. We call it DOMS. DOMS for short. Delayed onset of muscle soreness. Yeah, that's it. The DOMS. Everyone's experienced this. We'll talk about it a bit more. Okay, let's just test your knowledge a little bit from those what we just discussed. So elbow flexion, what would you say is the prime mover for elbow flexion? So think about the elbows. Flexion, we know, is where the angle at the joint gets smaller. So when the angle between your upper arm and your lower arm gets smaller, what muscle is contracting there? It's not the tricep, If it was elbow extension with the arm straightening, it would be. Yeah, it's the bicep. Yeah, so just remember that if the angle of the joint's getting smaller, it's flexion. So if the elbows are flexing, it's the biceps. What about shoulder adduction? So this is your arm going away from your body. What muscle is shortening in order for that to happen? Trickier one, that, isn't it? Deltoids. Oh, just in there. So it's mainly the medial deltoids that take the arm away from the midline of the body, but deltoids, yeah. Elbow extension. Oh, well, we covered that one, didn't we? Triceps. So when you think about a tricep push down, so you know when you push that bar downwards, so your elbows extend, hitting the triceps. Hip flexion. Oh, I mentioned this earlier, didn't I? When we were looking at the diagram of muscles. So that was the iliopsoas. Oh, just told you. Sorry, iliopsoas. Spine flexion. Think about the angle of the joint getting smaller, but referring to your spine. What's that one? What muscles work in there predominantly? People always striving to see these muscles. That's a big clue. Everyone's got them. They're just often hidden. Yeah, abs. Rectus abdominis. Okay, last one, hip extension. So this is your leg going backwards. So you think about, you know, as you're driving through on a deadlift, on a squat, when you're running, what muscle's responsible for that? Quads would be knee extension. Hamstrings, good. Yeah, that's one of them. And then there's also another one. The hamstrings are engaged a lot during hip extension, but they also, we tend to think about their role mainly as knee flexion. But you are totally right, Fern. But there's another muscle that is definitely about hip extension. An area that, in my experience, a lot of ladies ask to have developed. Yay, glutes. Gluteus maximus. I'll say that very carefully. In my experience, don't like to stereotype, but that is my experience. Right, and the nervous system. So this plays a role in, you know, everything that goes on inside the body. It's like the main control center for everything. And there's two components to it. So we have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So if you think about the central nervous system as like the brains behind the operation, literally, because it's the brain and the spinal cord. So that's making all the decisions and coordinating everything, telling everybody what to do, basically. The peripheral nervous system is like the information gatherer and passing messages around the body. And if we split the peripheral nervous system up, we have the somatic and the autonomic. And I mentioned the autonomic earlier, didn't I? Because I said that the autonomic nervous system controls all the automatic processes that go on inside the body. So it does stuff without us having to, you know, consciously tell it to. Now, the somatic part of the peripheral nervous system is the stuff that we control. So, you know, when we go, oh, I want to lift that weight up, that's the somatic component of the nervous system. Now, if we further divide the autonomic, so this is the part that, you know, we don't really control, although I'm sure people have learned to control this. From Tibetan monk somewhere, or David Blaine, he's always doing weird things, isn't he? Trying to control his mind and internal processes. So the sympathetic and parasympathetic, they describe this often, I think it's in a manual written as war and peace. So what that means is your sympathetic nervous system is responsible for getting you ready for activity, movement. And what that will do is it will speed up your heart rate, dilate your blood vessels, increase your breathing rate, do all the stuff that you need in order for you to produce movement. You know, mobilizing nutrients, all that sort of stuff. Your parasympathetic nervous system does the opposite, brings the heart rate down, brings the blood pressure down, brings your breathing rate down, dilates your blood vessels, and get you ready for rest and recovery. And that also sums up really the difference between your warm up and your cool down, because your warm up is triggering your sympathetic nervous system, and your cool down is triggering your parasympathetic nervous system. And if you look at like Chinese medicine, they talk about the yin and the yang, don't they? You could describe those as the yin and the yang. And you can't have one without the other. Now, another part of the nervous system is what we call a motor unit. And this has something to do with what we call the all or none law. So throughout your nervous system, you've got nerves, which are the smallest part of the nervous system, the smallest component, nerve cells, also known as neurons. And what they do is they relay the electrical impulses. So when I mentioned about the central nervous system communicating with the entire body, it does that via these neurons. So by sending electrical impulses through the neurons. Now, a motor unit is the neuron and then any muscle fibers it can stimulate or innervate. So they talk about the motor unit as either being on or off. So once you tell a motor unit to contract, it will either contract fully or not at all. There's never a partial stimulation. And what that means is if I want to produce a small amount of force, I don't partially contract my motor units. I just recruit less of them. So if I want to produce a huge amount of force, I'm going to recruit large motor units and lots of them. If I want to produce a small amount of force, like with fine movement control, like typing or writing, then I'm going to recruit less motor units and very, very small ones. And that's basically the all or none law. So when an impulse is sent down a neuron, all the muscle fibers within that motor unit will be innervated. The motor unit will activate all of its fibers or none of them. So have a think, use your note paper or use a chat box. Tell me what are the immediate effects of exercise on the neuromuscular system, and also what are the long-term effects. So just put some ideas down and we're going to go through them. Okay, good. So in the short term, we're going to produce power. And I guess what you mean by that is a short term is increased activity to the muscle. So we're going to be increasing the electrical impulse to the muscle. Yep. Now, obviously with that, so whenever we start exercising, the muscle temperature goes up because we direct blood to the working muscle. And that blood carries heat, it carries nutrients, and it carries oxygen. Now, when muscles are warmer, they become more pliable. So you think about something like blue tack, if you try and stretch it when it's cold, it breaks. If you warm it up and stretch it, you can stretch it loads. Increased power output from muscles, increased nerve to muscle link, increased recruitment of muscle fibers. And then the long term, well, just to sum it up in sort of one general term, we basically increase our muscular fitness. So that covers, muscular endurance, muscular strength, power, all that sort of stuff. Increased glycogen and creatine phosphate stores in the muscle, so we can actually store more energy substrates. Increase in actin and myosin, so that's where we actually lay down more protein filaments, which results in increased size of the muscle, so hypertrophy of the muscle. If we've got bigger muscles, we have a bigger metabolism because muscles have to be fed, so you will burn off more calories at rest. Better posture, increased neuromuscular connections, and what that means is you basically learn how to tap into more muscle fibers. So when you first start going to the gym, a lot of your strength gains don't come from increasing muscle size, especially as you get stronger in like 2 weeks. That's not more muscle. That's that you've learned to contract the muscle that already exists. And that is increased recruitment of motor units. Okay, let's move on to cardiovascular and respiratory systems. Starting with the heart, so you can see straight away the heart is found in the center of the chest, isn't it? But it's just left of center. So remember that, just left of center. And this area here, we refer to that as a thoracic cavity. So it's the space behind the sternum and the ribs. So it's a muscular pump, and it's responsible for pushing oxygen and nutrients around the body to its tissues. So let's go through the blood flow and all the little components of the heart, because this bit is important. You do need to remember this, so revisit this if you need to. First of all, we've got the superior and the inferior vena cava. Now, why do you think that writing's in blue? Any ideas? Not just because I like the colour blue. I prefer green, actually. Green's my favourite colour. So why do you think that's in blue? Great answer. Blood before it's exposed to oxygen. Yeah, so basically that's suggesting that that contains deoxygenated blood, which is correct. So the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava deliver deoxygenated blood into the first chamber, which is the right atrium. And although it looks like to you guys that first chamber, so this chamber here, you think, well, that's on the left of the heart. Well, it's the left as you're looking at it, but if that was inside somebody's body, it's the right. It's their right side. So we call that the right atrium. That fills up with blood, pushes this valve open, and then the blood drops down into the next chamber, which is the right ventricle. So think of the atrium as a collecting chamber, and then the right ventricle, that's the contracting chamber, because what that will do is that will squeeze, push blood out this here, which is called the pulmonary artery. And the way I remember that is arteries take blood away from the heart. So think about A for away. The pulmonary arteries take blood away from the heart, and pulmonary, just think about lungs. Associate the word pulmonary with lungs. So pulmonary artery takes blood away from the heart to the lungs. What's it picking up in the lungs, guys? Something good that we need. oxygen, and it gets rid of carbon dioxide as well. So then it comes back in by the pulmonary vein. So notice the writing has become red now because it's oxygenated. Now this is another little helpful tip. It always helps me. So some of these, you know, these little tips, you might think they're absolute nonsense and completely ignore them if you want. If they're not, they don't float your boat, but they always work for me. So in the word vein, you can see there's the word in. So veins take blood into the heart. A for away, and then in for in. So pulmonary veins take the oxygenated blood into this chamber here. So we're now on the other side of the heart. So that's the left atrium. Fills up, pushes this valve open, floods down into the left ventricle. And you can see on the diagram there that this part of the heart, the cardiac muscle, is much thicker. And that's because it's basically hypertrophy. Like if you were to do lots of bicep curls, your biceps get bigger. Well, this part of the heart has got to pump blood around the entire body. So it's been doing some resistance training. So this is weaker side over here doesn't have to pump the blood very far. It's going to just pump up to the lungs. But this one's got to pump it around the whole body. So it's much thicker. Now, when that does a big contraction, it sends blood out this way. And this is the thickest, largest blood vessel in the body, called the aorta. And that sends blood, like I said, around the entire body. And the reason why it's so thick and strong is because it's got to withstand high blood pressure. So what's a good habit to get into is to learn the order, because you often get questions that say, where does the blood go to after it leaves the pulmonary vein? Where does the blood go to after it leaves the left ventricle? Where does the blood go to after it leaves the right atrium? So write them out in order, you know, vena cava, right atrium, right ventricle, and so on, and just learn the order. There we go. Sexy little animation for you. Okay, now we also divide circulation up into two separate systems, or different ways to describe it. So we've got pulmonary and we've got systemic. Now, pulmonary circulation refers to the movement of blood between the heart and the lungs. So that's why I said remember pulmonary and associate that with lungs. So all those chambers and vessels that connect the lungs and the heart are part of the pulmonary system. And then all those chambers and vessels that connect the heart and the entire body are part of the systemic system. So again, you know, I'd say that's worth remembering. So make sure you know the difference there. And it just helps just going through those slides again and rewriting things out in your own notes. But once you understand that really well, you can answer pretty much any question on that. So the pulmonary system, just to reiterate, the pulmonary system is the movement of blood between the heart and the lungs. And the systemic system is the movement of blood between the heart and the entire body. Or think about the entire system. Okay, so we keep talking about blood. It's useful to know actually what's in it, what's it comprised of. So something we've already mentioned previously is red blood cells. So these transport oxygen around the body. So they bind to oxygen and sort of carry it around the body. So that's one of the things that we've got inside the blood. We've also got our white blood cells. So these fight infection. We have platelets. So when you guys cut yourselves, they will form clots to help you from, well, stop the bleeding and stop you bleeding to death. And then we have plasma. And plasma is like the straw-colored liquid that you find inside your blood. And it's what, you know, one of the reasons why we have to stay hydrated. If we drink lots of water, it contributes towards the blood plasma in our blood. And that means that it will make up the volume of blood, but it means your heart doesn't have to work quite so hard to pump it around the body. If you have a low blood plasma because you're dehydrated, it's very thick and viscous then, your blood, so your heart's got to work extra hard to push the blood around the body. I had to do a lot of research in hydration when I worked at Brighton Hove Albion Football Club, and one of the things I was doing was, it's sad actually, but I had to watch a game and track how often the guys hydrated, and I'd weigh them before and after training to see how much lighter they were, and I'd work out how dehydrated they were. And we know, from research that as little as 1% dehydration affects performance. So you just can't perform as well if you're 1% dehydrated. So the way to work that out is if you weigh 100 kilos and you weigh yourself naked before you go out and train, and when you come back in, you're a kilo lighter, you're 1% dehydrated. And that will affect performance. So one of the reasons why we should stay hydrated, apart from keeping yourself alive as well, which is often important. They've also mentioned blood pressure. Blood pressure is defined as a measure of the force that blood applies to the walls of the arteries as blood flows through them. So much like water, as water goes through pipes, it exerts pressure on the pipe. Well, blood will exert pressure on your vessels, your blood vessels. Now the systolic, so if we take a blood pressure reading of 120/80, which is what we call optimal blood pressure, the first number, the 120, is your systolic pressure. And that's the pressure when your heart's contracting. The second number, so the 80, that's the diastolic. So that's the pressure when your heart's filling. There's always a difference there. It clearly is going to be greater pressure when your heart's contracting than when it's relaxing. Total peripheral resistance is basically the resistance of the vessels to the blood flow. So our blood vessels are supposed to have contractile properties to them, which means they dilate and constrict quite freely. If they become very hard and rigid, our blood pressure goes up, and our blood vessels can get damaged as well if they become hard and rigid. Excuse me. So if we look at this table here, you can see what would represent a low blood pressure reading. Now, we don't tend to worry too much about low blood pressure, just because it's certainly not as harmful as having high blood pressure, but there isn't really a great deal you can do for it. Some people naturally have low blood pressure, which really means that you might feel dizzy and get lightheaded, certainly if you get up too quickly. So as a trainer, it's still useful to know, because if your client does have low blood pressure, you're going to be a bit mindful when you'll get them to get on the ground and get back up. You might not have so many rapid transitions from getting on the floor, get back up, getting on the floor, get back up, just to sort of control the risk, really. Optimal's at 120/80. Now, as your blood pressure goes up, if it hits the 130/85, it's not an issue. Like, it's not particularly bad. But we would class that as high normal or pre-hypertension. So it's just like, well, okay, let's keep an eye on this. If it continues to go up and your systole goes to 140 or above, and your diastole is 90 or above, that's stage 1 hypertension. So at that point, you would ask them to go and see their doctor and just double check, just get on the radar, really. Now, if it continues to rise and you get 160 on the systole or 100 on diastole, that becomes stage 2 hypertension. And if it goes even higher, 180 or 110, that's stage 3. Now, we also call that an absolute contraindication to exercise. So it's too high for somebody to exercise safely. They need to get that down. And that'll be through medication. Usually the doctor will give them some tablets to get it controlled, so they can address the reason why it's so high. Now, the way I remember these blood pressures is, if you have a look, you can see, starting from optimal, you've got 120/80. Now, when we go to stage 1 hypertension, we jump up by 20 on the systole and 10 on the diastole. When we go to stage 2, we do the same again. We jump up by 20 on the systole and 10 on a diastole. When we go to stage 3, we jump up by 20 again on the systole and 10 on the diastole. And most of your questions are normally to do with what's optimal, what's stage 1, what's stage 2, and what's stage 3. So just count up in 20s on the systole and count up in 10s on the diastole. And that's the best way. So remember optimal, 120/80. And then when you want to go stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, count up in 20s on the systole and 10s on the diastole. Okay, now you also need to have a little bit of an understanding about your lungs, which I'm sure you guys probably have an understanding already. But they are also found in the thoracic cavity. So that's that space again behind the sternum and the ribs. So that's the main job of the sternum and the ribs, is to protect the heart and lungs. Now, when we inhale, obviously we're receiving oxygen. So the oxygen's diffusing into the blood. When we exhale, we're trying to remove carbon dioxide. So that's diffusing out of the body. And we refer to that exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen as gaseous exchange. And if you see the word diffusion come up, diffusion is really gaseous exchange, because it's referring to gases of a high concentration going to an area of low concentration. So if you've got loads of loads of carbon dioxide inside your blood, but there isn't as much outside of your blood, then that's why it diffuses, and that's the gaseous exchange bit. Bit complicated, bit sciencey, but just remember those two words really: gaseous exchange and diffusion. Oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. Now, I've underlined these because these are important. Diaphragm and intercostals, they are the muscles responsible for breathing. So sometimes when you say to someone, what's responsible for breathing? Your instant reaction is your lungs, isn't it? You think, oh, my lungs do that. Well, they don't really. They do the respiration bit, I guess, but they don't actually control the breath coming in and the breath going out. It's the muscles that do that. So you can see you've got a sheath of muscle at the bottom of your thoracic cavity, and then you've got some muscles between the ribs, and they will control the size of your chest cavity. If your chest cavity goes very big, air can then get drawn into the lungs. If your chest cavity gets smaller, air gets pushed out. So that's what's controlling breathing. Okay, so let's just think about the airway now, or the direction of airflow. So when we breathe, the first place it comes in is obviously the mouth and the nose. It then travels down to this little opening here called the pharynx. We then have another little area called the larynx, which is also known as your voice box. It travels then through this, what you probably know as the windpipe, but the technical term for it is the trachea. The trachea then splits into two branches. So you can see there's one branch going into one lung, one branch going into the other lung, and they are called bronchi if you're referring to them as, in plural, or if you're talking about just one of them, it's the bronchiole. Sorry, bronchus. Bronchi is one, bronchus is two, or the other way around actually. Bronchus is one, bronchi is two, and then they further divide into little branches called the bronchioles. Now, on the end of those, you've got some little air sacs. Does anyone know what they're called, the little air sacs? Begin with A. Sounds a bit like ravioli. Well, sort of. Yeah, you got in there, Ash. Well done. Alveoli. So alveoli are the air sacs right on the end of those bronchioles, and they are surrounded in capillaries that are responsible for the gaseous exchange that I talked about earlier. So if you see anything to do with alveoli, think about gaseous exchange. Oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. So what are the effects of exercise on the cardiovascular and respiratory systems? What happens in the short term, guys? Use your chat box or write some notes down on your paper. Good. So we've got increased heart rate, certainly. As soon as you start exercising, your heart rate goes up. What else goes up? Just picture yourself now, doing your warm-up. What's going on? Breathing rate, yeah. Okay, so heart rate, breathing rate, your systolic blood pressure goes up because it's going to have to contract more forcefully. You get something called vasodilations. That's where your blood vessels open up to allow more blood to go through. The volume of air goes up in the lungs. Your stroke volume goes up. Now, your stroke volume is the amount of blood that gets pumped out your heart with one contraction. So, it can mean anything from like 50 milliliters to 75 milliliters. Increasing cardiac output, and that is the volume of blood that's pumped in a minute. So that would be your stroke volume times your heart rate, basically. So the volume of blood that's pumped within a minute. Now, long term, what's happening long term? Think about endurance athletes and the effects on their body. What's going on there? Lower heart rate. Yeah, so it's lower resting heart rate, certainly. And actually, your exercise heart rate will be lower for the same conditions, if that makes sense. So like if you run at 10 kilometers an hour for 20 minutes, in the long term, that exercise heart rate will be lower if you train regularly. So decrease resting and working heart rate, increase aerobic capacity. So that means that you can exercise using your aerobic energy system for higher intensities. Normalize blood pressure. So that means if you do have elevated blood pressure, your blood pressure can be normalized down to that 120/80. Increase hypertrophy or muscle growth of the left ventricle, and that's really what's responsible for the lower resting heart rate and a greater stroke volume. Increased size of elasticity of the arteries, increased capillary network, and that's in short, that's basically called capillarization. So you develop more capillaries, more gaseous exchange. Increased strength of your respiratory muscles, that's the diaphragm, the intercostals. Increased stroke volume and cardiac output. So as I mentioned, if you've got a stronger left ventricle, pump more blood out with every contraction. You also get to lower your blood cholesterol. So you have, your low density lipoproteins, which is what we call your bad cholesterol, really, the ones that lead to atherosclerosis, which is something that lines the arteries, not good for you. Increased blood volume and increased size of mitochondria. So there's loads of stuff there, isn't there? When you look at it from a physiological level, when you train, all that good stuff that's going on. Okay, let's move on to the digestive system. And we're just approaching lunchtime, so I do apologize if this is going to make you hungry a bit. Okay, so there's 4 functions really going on inside the digestive system. We've got ingestion, which is where the food enters the body through the mouth, and we basically break it down through mastication. So be careful how you say that. Write it down if you've never heard that word before, mastication. And that is the mechanical breakdown of food by chewing. You've also got digestion, which is where our food is then broken down through the action of all the smooth muscle tissue that we mentioned and all the digestive enzymes that break it down. Once that's all taken place, we then have absorption, which is where it's all then passed into the bloodstream. So all the nutrients, all the water that we want to take out the food gets entered into our cells. And then elimination is the removal via your anus, poo, basically. Just to clarify. And this is the structure. So if you look at it, they're all the different components. You've got your mouth, your esophagus, stomach, pancreas, liver, gallbladder, small intestine, large intestine, rectum, and anus. So let's talk about how they work and what the functions of each are. So mouth, pretty straightforward. That's the entry point. That's the process of mastication. You then got your esophagus, which is carries that food down to the stomach. But there's also a term called peristalsis, which is where your esophagus basically contracts and relaxes and pushes the food down. In the stomach, you've got some breakdown going on. So there's various enzymes that break the food down, like pepsin, trypsin, lipase, and it also contains hydrochloric acid, which kills the bacteria. Then you've got your small intestine, and that's where most of the absorption takes place, really. So most of the absorption of the nutrients takes place. It goes into the bloodstream, we pass to the body tissues. And then from the small intestine, it goes to your large intestine, where it will absorb the remaining nutrients, but also the water, so that you're then just left with the feces, which obviously gets secreted or excreted is the word, isn't it, out your bum. Now, some other key components, you've got your liver and your pancreas. So your liver secretes bile, and we need bile basically to emulsify fat. Fat, if you dropped a lump of fat in a glass of water, it just kind of sits on top, but bile helps it mix with the fat with the water, so we can then absorb it. It helps the removal of nutrients, a bit detoxifying, removal of bacteria. And then the pancreas secretes some of the digestive juices, enzymes and what have you. And if we didn't have those enzymes, basically just things wouldn't get broken down. They speed up the breakdown of things. Now, this whole process can take up to 72 hours. So, you know, when somebody eats something and, you know, half an hour later, like, oh, I forgot I shouldn't have eaten that. I think it's maybe poorly. Well, very unlikely. It takes a long time to digest food. 72 hours it can be for, you know, a big heavy meal. Everyone's digestive system, by the way, works at slightly different rates. So that's a generalization, 72 hours. But you know, if you get a question on that, that's your answer. But we do, and different foods digest at different rates. Okay, that's basically all you need to know for digestive system. So just make sure you know those slides there, and you know how the different components kind of work, at least to the level where you could recognize an answer if it comes up in an exam. Okay, so we get our energy from the food that we eat. So what are the macronutrients that we find inside food, guys? 3 main macronutrients. Have a think. If you use MyFitnessPal, when you look at your food diary, it will break your foods up into, there we go, proteins, there's one. Proteins, fats, and carbs, yep. So carbohydrates contain 4 calories per gram. They get broken down into, well, they get stored as glycogen, which is found in the muscles and the liver. You get about, you can usually store about 1,500 calories of carbohydrate in the body in the form of glycogen. Any excess just gets turned into fat. Now, what we tend to use it for mainly is energy. It's our most easily accessible form of energy. And it's found in things like breads and fruits, vegetables, all your whole grains, pasta, and that type of thing. Protein's also got 4 calories per gram. That gets broken down into amino acids. Any excess is also stored as fat. So we used to think that protein couldn't be. Like not even that long ago, I'm sure, like my first course, I was taught that protein, excess protein, you just poo out. But we now know that's not true. Any excess nutrients can be stored as fat. It's responsible for growth and repair. I mean, it has a lot of roles, but when we sum it up into a short sentence, it's growth and repair. So whether it's bone, skin, nails, hair, whatever, we repair those cells and we grow more using amino acids. And we've got fats. Now, if you look at those, they contain 9 calories per gram, which is a lot of energy, which is one of the reasons why I guess fats gets a bad reputation. A bit unfair, because fats are brilliant. They've got so many good nutritional benefits to them. However, like with anything, you can have too much of a bad thing or too much of a good thing. I think that's the expression, isn't it? They get broken down into fatty acids. We store them around our vital organs and adipose tissue. And really, if we sum it up in the sort of most important function, it's energy and insulation. So it's our biggest energy source. So I mentioned that carbohydrates, we can store up to 1,500 calories worth. Well, 1 pound of fat is 3,500 calories. So, you know, there's almost 3 times as many calories in just 1 pound of fat than there is carbohydrates stored in the entire body. So you've got endless amounts of energy, really, when it comes to fat. If you were to exercise without eating and you just kept exercising for as long as you possibly could, you would actually die of sleep deprivation before you ran out of fuel. Okay, so we've got 3 energy systems that will utilize our macronutrients to produce something called ATP. So it doesn't matter whether you're eating fats, carbs, or protein. If you're using it for fuel to create movement, it will eventually be turned into ATP. An ATP is adenosine triphosphate, and it's often referred to as the universal currency of energy, which means that every time, if you go back to that muscular skeletal system slide where it showed the actin and the myosin, I don't know if you remember, but I said something about the hook-like projections or the cross bridges of the myosin grabbing the actin and pulling it towards it. It's ATP that is responsible for that. So that's why we need ATP. And we've got 3 systems. So we've got the phosphocreatine system, the lactate system, the aerobic system that will generate ATP. Now, the first one I mentioned, phosphocreatine system, this is what we call an anaerobic energy system because all the chemical processes involved with that system happen without the aid of oxygen. And it uses stored ATP, but it also uses creatine phosphate. Now, I don't want to get too heavy on this because you don't really need to know too much detail on this other than it's used for high intensity exercise lasting between sort of 6 and 10 seconds. So very, very short duration, but very high intensity. So think about someone sprinting, creatine phosphate, sprinting over a short distance, creatine phosphate is going to provide a lot of the ATP for that activity. And it has no fatiguing waste products. However, like I said, it's only 6 to 10 seconds. So if you want to work at high intensity, your performance is going to start to slow after about, if your maximal exertion, it's going to start to slow slightly after about your 100-meter sprint, usually. It's also responsible for things like javelin, shot put, golf, tennis swing, weightlifting, high jumping. So just think about really short but maximal kind of activities. Now, if you want to keep going, that's where your lactate system is going to start to take over most of the work. So it's still anaerobic, this one. And what the lactate system does is it uses glycogen, which it breaks down and turns into glucose. to produce movement or to produce ATP that way. Now, it's a great system because it means you can work longer than you can just using your creatine phosphate, but it does produce a fatiguing waste product called lactic acid, hence the name lactate system. And the lactic acid, what it does is, apart from the fact that it's not very pleasant, it's horrible, isn't it? It will affect the contraction of the muscle over time. So it's, without getting too technical, it's called acidosis, but it affects muscle contraction. So eventually you just can't work as effectively, can you? We've all had it. Your muscles are flooded with lactate. They're burning. You just have to stop. So that'll keep you going between 1 to 3 minutes of intense activity. And then really the majority of the work is then going to come from your aerobic system. So the lactate system activities include 400-meter sprint, 100-meter swim, 200-meter swim or hurdles. Really, just think about any activity where it hurts. It's just really unpleasant. Bodybuilding, I mean, that definitely produces a lot of lactate. So this is the third and final system, and this is the preferred system because it's actually really efficient. When we work aerobically, which means we utilize oxygen to produce ATP, we can use carbs, fats, and we can even use protein actually to produce that. But we can just get so much ATP from it, and it makes sense, doesn't it? Because if you think about ultra marathon runners, they will be utilizing their aerobic system mainly, and you can just go for so long. There's people I've read that have, there's a good book actually, Born to Run, but there's people that run like 200 miles to get to a marathon, to then run a marathon, like crazy distances, and that's because we've got a lot of energy that allows us to do that. Don't recommend it. Okay, so aerobic system activities would include long distance running, of course, marathons, triathlons, long distance swimming, long distance cycling. Okay, guys, this is the last section, so hang in there. And it's not too long either, so I've kept it super concise to what I think you guys should really focus your studies on. And this is looking at components of fitness and special populations. So use your chat box or write these down in your notes. What do you think are the components of health-related fitness? So imagine someone coming to the gym, talking to a gym instructor. Gym instructor says, "Why are you here? What do you want to do?" What are the different areas of health-related fitness that a trainer can work on for somebody? Think about your own goals. What do you want to do? Flexibility. Thank you. That's one. Cardiovascular fitness, muscular strength, muscle endurance. Brilliant. Well, there's one missing. It's always the one that's left till last, actually. It's the one that people were most concerned with. Yeah, we don't call it that. We call it body composition. So we've got cardiovascular fitness, muscular endurance, muscular strength, flexibility, and body composition. Now we've also got skill-related fitness. And people don't tend to, like when you work in a gym as a gym instructor, you don't really get asked this much. Like people don't come in and say they want to work on areas of their skill-related fitness. There are areas that will automatically improve from a good balanced training program. But these tend to be more to do with your motor skills. So this is all about practicing things and rehearsing things again and again and again. So what do you reckon comes under the heading of skill-related fitness? Think about sportsmen and women that some things they practice and that might improve to help their sport. Speed and power. Anything else? Think about a boxer when he's got a punch. There we go. Reaction time. Read my mind. What about a gymnast on a beam? Balance. What about doing some ballroom dancing and carrying out something like the fandango? Is that even a dance? I don't know. I think I've just made that up. No, that's not helping anyone, is it? Okay, I was thinking coordination. Oh, there we go. You got it. You knew what I meant. He knows the fandango. Ash is a bit partial to the fandango. So we've had speed, power, reaction time, coordination, balance, and agility. Ah, we forgot about that one, didn't we? So agility. So let's just quickly go through those. So speed is all about quickness of movement. So think about the hands of a boxer or the feet of a football player. Speed, quickness of movement. Power is generating force, but very, very quickly in a very, very short space of time. So if you put a huge amount of force into the floor very, very quickly, you're going to jump very, very high. Reaction time, how quickly you can respond to a stimulus. So that's what I was about to say about the punch coming towards a boxer's head. Coordination, that's the ability to coordinate two or more body parts. So, I mean, that's every sport, isn't it? So whether it's a layup in basketball or doing the fandango. Is that fandango? Where have I got that from? Is that from the Bohemian Rhapsody? Sorry, going off at a tangent there. Balance, that is being able to maintain stability either while static or moving. And then agility, that's about explosiveness of movement, but in rapid changes of direction. Cheers for the update there, Ash. Okay, now principles of training. There's some keywords here that I recommend you guys just be able to recognize and link up. You know, so if you look at the description, look at the definition, no, the term and the definition, and make sure you can link them up. So specificity is suggesting basically that the adaptations that go on inside the body are very specific to the stress that's imposed on our bodies. And that's why if someone comes to the gym and they go, yeah, I want to get fit, you don't just give them a program, go, well, there you go, there's your get fit program, because it's not necessarily specific to their goals and what they want to improve on. Progressive overload. Now, this is where if we want to get better, and I talk about this a lot, we have to subject our muscles to a stress they're not accustomed to. It's the only way, and this is where that no pain, no gain thing comes from, which people do take to the extreme and probably do a little bit too much. But unfortunately, if we want to force our body into adapting, we have to do something different. And that usually means playing around with our FIT acronym. So increasing the frequency of what we do, increasing the intensity, increasing the time or duration of what we're doing, or choosing a different type of training. Adaptability, reversibility is use it or lose it. Just think about that. Use it or lose it. If we don't get to a point, do we, where we look at ourselves in the mirror and we go, damn. Actually, I don't think anyone gets to that point, but you don't look at someone and go, yeah, look at that. I've got these great big arms. I've got amazing abs. Super quick. I can quit. I don't have to train now. I'm done. Because your brain will recognize that if there's no stimulus present any longer, I might as well get rid of all these gains. So it will make your muscles smaller. Because don't forget, all these adaptations that go on inside the body, yeah, you're a fitter, stronger, better version of yourself, but you're also a stronger, fitter, better version of yourself that's going to burn up more nutrients. So the survival methods inside the body will say, well, if we don't need that stuff, let's get rid of it. Adaptability. So the body reacts and adapts in accordance with the type of challenge and overload which is subjected. It's very similar to specificity, but it's more talking about the fact that the body is very good at doing that. So if there's a stimulus present, over time we'll adapt. And there's loads of examples of this with Thai kickboxers kicking trees with their shins, damaging their shins so they get thicker and stronger. Even to the point where, do you remember Milo? Well, you won't remember him because he's about 2,000 years old, but you might have heard the story of Milo and the bull, where this guy basically put a calf on his back, took it into town, and he did it every day. And obviously the calf grew into a bull, and Milo grew as well, because as the bull was getting heavier, his muscles would have to hypertrophy to carry the bull. I guess you could say Milo was the founder of bodybuilding in Greek mythology. Recovery and rest. This refers to the fact that all these adaptations, they don't happen when you're training, they happen when you're resting. And that's why it's so important. And people talk about what's the optimum amount of volume for training? What's the optimum amount of intensity for training? And we can't really answer that question, not really, because it's very personal to you. And a lot of trainers will say there's no such thing as overtraining, there's only under recovering, because basically you can train as hard as you want or like or whatever, as long as you allow enough rest to recover. But that varies. Some people can go to bed at night, wake up the next day and they're recovered. Others need longer. And then individuality. And this is really important to remember this as a trainer. This isn't just for you passing your theory exam, but definitely going to make you a better trainer, because everyone's different. Like we have to have some sort of reference point with things. So we use guidelines and what have you just to give us a starting point. But actually, people commonly don't fall within the recommended guidelines with things. And, there's people that are just freaks of nature that, can train harder, longer, more frequently than others and recover. And there's some people that can't do that, the opposite end, they need a lot more recovery. So just remember, everyone's different. Everyone's got their own abilities, own range of motion, own experiences and goals and preferences and everything else. And everyone has their own body type as well. So we refer to these as ectomorphs, mesomorphs, and endomorphs. So if you look at the picture there, you can see that an ectomorph is somebody that has low muscle mass, low body fat. A mesomorph is someone that has low body fat, large muscles, and an endomorph is someone that has usually large muscle, but also large body fat, large quantity of body fat. Why is this important? Well, when we do something called like athletic profiling, we look at an individual and we look at all their characteristics, and we analyze that and we say, well, where are they now and where do they need to be in relation to excelling at a particular sport? And certain sports require, or you do better at, when you have a specific body type. So if you are lean and muscular, you tend to have a very high strength to body weight ratio. So things like sprinting and mixed martial arts, they generally contain mesomorphs. So you look at those athletes, they're mainly mesomorphs, is what I'm trying to say. If you look at marathon runners, well, they need to have a very low mass to exercise for a long period of time. They don't want a large mass. So low muscle mass, low body fat, and so they are ectomorphs generally. And then endomorphs, well, throwers mainly. If you look at shot putters, they tend to have large muscle mass, but also large body fat. And it's not high mass body fat, and it's not because the fat's useful for throwing necessarily. It's basically that it's not really a hindrance. So if you want to get strong, you lift and you eat. If you want to have low body fat, it's a bit more tricky, isn't it? But if it's not going to hinder you and you want to be a really good thrower, eat and lift and throw. Now, your body fat isn't, sorry, your body type isn't set in stone. So you can change it. So, you know, I don't want people to have limiting self-beliefs where, oh, I'm an ectomorph, so I can never be anything else. And same for an endomorph. Well, obviously, that's where training and diet comes in. Okay, now this is your last slide for revision. So this is just focused on some guidelines for older adults. So if you're going to train somebody that's an older adult, so we're talking 50 plus, and that guy, look, what's he, 60, 65 maybe 70, I don't know. So think about, as you're getting older, what are some guidelines that are gonna that we recommend when writing programs and training these clients, taking into consideration the fact they are getting older? Use your chat box or scribble it down some note paper. Longer warm up, absolutely. It takes longer, doesn't it, to raise your body temperature when you're older. Lower intensity, yep. So we tend to not push the heart rate up quite so high. And don't forget, these are guidelines. So don't, you know, if you've got some guy in the gym, he's an older adult and he's training hard, you know, you don't feel you've got to go up to him and go, really easy, sunshine, slow the pace down there, because you might actually get some abuse. But when you're older, the likelihood of having higher blood pressure, that type of thing, is higher. Higher impact, yeah, sorry, lower impact, yeah. So impact is things like the joint. So if you're running and jumping, that's more impact in the joint. So we tend to do less of that because of the thinness of the ligaments, but also the cartilage. There's less shock absorption. Okay, so longer, more gradual warm up and cool down, more mobility, slower, controlled and simpler movements. So we don't want really complex movements because cognitive abilities aren't as good when you're older. It basically takes you longer to learn. It just becomes frustrating. Focus on posture and correct technique. You're more injury prone when you're older. As we said, lower impact intensity. More time for transitions. So this is something, if you ever teach an over 50s class, you'll notice that you don't want an exercise on the floor, then one standing up, then on the floor, then one standing up, because it can take somebody 60 seconds to get from the floor to a standing position. So, you know, it just becomes very impractical. Avoid extreme spinal flexion. Strengthen postural muscles, pelvic floor muscles, and any sort of potential fracture sites. So weight bearing exercise is actually really good, and resistance training is really good. Maintain functional capacity. So I guess the emphasis is to just improve their quality of life or maintain their quality of life. All right. We covered a lot there, didn't we? So that is basically the main focus, or what I suggest you guys focus your revision on, sort of that and around that, for your theory exam. So revisit the webinar, watch it again, take notes. I'm going to upload these slides as well to the webinar folder in Edmodo. So have a look at the slides if you want to just do something a little bit quicker. Don't forget the exam's 50 questions. It is multiple choice, so you don't have to spell things correctly. You've just got to read the question, look for the answer. You basically put a cross in A, B, C, or D. There's only one correct answer. You've got to get 35 out of 50. And you can book your exam in when you feel like you're ready. They're on every other Saturday at 8 AM at Southwick Leisure Centre. And the booking link's in Edmodo.